Beneath a stretch of cleared land just outside Troyes, France, something was waiting to blow apart a century of assumptions about the ancient Celts. The isolated barbarian story is wrong. One Gaulish grave proves Celtic elites were living inside the Mediterranean world, not just trading with it from a distance. Today, behind museum glass in Troyes, the label still reads Prince. The evidence underneath that word has already moved on without permission. Archaeologist Bastien Dubuis led the NRAP crew that pulled it from the clay in October 2014. Expecting a warrior's tomb, what came up broke every rule anyone expected. Look closer. This is where it gets strange. The site sat on the edge of a commercial development zone called the Zac du Moutot, on the northern fringe of Troyes, in the Aube region of Champagne. Before construction crews could break ground, French law required a preventive survey, standard procedure, run thousands of times a year, almost none of it newsworthy. This one was different. Ground-penetrating equipment and test trenches had already flagged something beneath the topsoil. Ditches cut in straight, deliberate lines, the kind that don't occur naturally. As the crew dug deeper, they realized they weren't looking at a single grave. They were looking at a monument, a funerary complex reused across centuries, with rectangular enclosures aligned to the compass points, corners cut with a precision that shouldn't have existed in a primitive landscape. At the center of it, under a low mound roughly 40 meters across, excavators found a burial chamber built from oak about the size of a small room, holding a two-wheeled chariot and a single occupant laid out with a wealth that had no business being buried in the ground. Autumn rain had turned the trench walls slick and dark, and the crew worked under tarps, racing weather as much as time. Gloved hands moved centimeter by centimeter through the soil, brushing rather than digging once the first gleam of metal appeared. Every stroke risked destroying the very evidence they were trying to save, and everyone on site knew it. What the team found, once the dirt came away, was a grave dated to roughly 450 BCE, deep in what historians call the early Latini period, the classic age of the Celtic world. The contents did not read like a modest local burial. A solid gold torque weighing close to 500 grams, its surface catching light after 25 centuries in the dark, gold bracelets, an amber necklace, a belt fastened with iron and coral, a knife in its sheath, and a cauldron nearly a meter wide, decorated with the horned, mustached face of the Greek river god Achelous, ringed by handles shaped like snarling lion heads, each one cast with a precision that stopped the excavation team in place when it first broke the surface. Inside the cauldron sat something even stranger, a wine jug, Greek-made, painted in the black figure style, showing the god Dionysus, reclining at a banquet, facing a woman across the scene. Its rim had been inlaid with gold and silver, and part of that decoration had clearly been added later, on French soil by someone working in a completely different tradition. Not a copy, not an imitation, but a genuine modification made by a local hand on a foreign object. Three cultures fused onto one object: Greek pottery, Etruscan or Mediterranean metalwork, and Celtic ornamentation, buried together in a Gaulish tomb centuries before Rome ever conquered this land. This is the part of the story that made headlines from Paris to New York. Because the popular image of the ancient Celts has never been this. For most people, Iron Age Gaul is a world of tribal warbands, blue-painted warriors, isolated farming communities north of the civilized Mediterranean. That image did not appear by accident. Rome's own writers helped cement it. Barbarians beyond the border, useful mainly as a threat or a conquest. A people defined by what they lacked rather than what they built. The Lavau tomb, the moment it opened, made that picture look thin. Here was a Gaulish elite burial containing luxury goods that NRAP's own president, Dominique Garcia, has pointed out are rarer than anything found in most actual Greek tombs of the same period. Not just wealthy in a way that should not have been possible this far from the sea. So the label came fast, and it came confidently. The Prince of Lavau. A young aristocrat, a warrior chief. A man who ruled a Celtic territory rich enough to trade directly with the Mediterranean world. It fits the shape people already expect a prince to take. Gold, chariot, cauldron, power. For the first few years after the discovery, that is roughly where the public conversation stayed. All at the wealth, all at the craftsmanship, all at the scale of the find. Nobody was in a hurry to complicate a story this good. But there was a problem. No weapons. Not one sword, not one spear point. Nothing that unambiguously marked this person as a warrior. Gold bracelets, the kind more commonly associated, in period burials across the Celtic world with women. Early on, before full analysis, the sex of the occupant genuinely was not settled. A prince with no weapon, wearing jewelry, buried with a wine service instead of arms. That combination raises an immediate and uncomfortable question. Are we looking at a warrior chief at all, or someone already misjudged based on nothing but the objects sitting next to the bones, the same way archaeologists have misjudged burials for over a century? That question should sound familiar. France has been here before. 61 years earlier, in January 1953, a farmer named Maurice Moisson was digging near the village of Vix, at the base of a hill called Mont la Soie in Burgundy, when he uncovered the handle of something enormous. What came out of that mound, excavated by archaeologist René Geoffroy, is still one of the most famous single objects in European prehistory. The Vix crater. 1 meter, 64 centimeters tall, over 200 kilograms. A single sheet of hammered bronze, barely more than a millimeter thick, formed into a vessel that could hold over 1,000 liters of wine, ringed with a frieze of marching hoplites and chariots, its handles cast as 3 snarling Gorgon heads. Made in Greece, or possibly a Greek workshop in southern Italy, around 530 to 520 BCE, the largest known bronze vessel to survive from the entire ancient world. Beside it lay a solid gold torque, its terminals shaped into tiny winged horses, on filigree pedestals so fine they look almost machined. Attic pottery, Etruscan bronze basins, a silver dish, all of it arranged around a single skeleton, laid on the dismantled bed of a 4-wheeled ceremonial wagon inside a wood-lined chamber under a mound that once measured 42 meters across, a monument built to be seen from a distance, on a hill overlooking the river routes below. For years, the assumption ran exactly the way it would decades later at Lavau. This much wealth had to belong to a warrior chief, a Celtic prince ruling a river trade network stretching toward the Mediterranean. Museums built it into their labels. Textbooks repeated it without a second thought. Then the bones were properly examined. They were female. Not ambiguous. Female. And rather than update the story, some researchers, faced with grave goods that looked masculine beside a body that was biologically female, reached for an explanation that preserved the old assumption instead of questioning it. One theory floated by researcher Carl Spindler in the 1980s suggested the occupant might have been a man dressed and buried in women's ornamentation, a priest performing a female role for ritual purposes. Confronted with evidence that broke the pattern, some of the field's own experts tried to bend the evidence back into the pattern instead of letting the pattern break. It did not hold. In 1991, archaeologist Bettina Arnold published a sharp critique of exactly this instinct, using Vix as a case study in how gender assumptions had been shaping and distorting the interpretation of prehistoric burials across Europe. Then, in 2002, Christopher Knussel carried out a full skeletal reanalysis, published in the European Journal of Archaeology. His conclusion was direct. An adult woman, likely in her 30s or 40s at death, with unusually androgynous facial and cranial features, possibly linked to a hormonal condition, along with signs of chronic ear infection that would have caused her real, lasting pain. Knussel went further, suggesting she may not have been a political ruler in the traditional sense at all, but something closer to a ritual specialist, a woman whose authority came from ceremony, not the sword. Today, the Vix treasure sits under glass at the Musée du Pays Châtillonnais, inside a former abbey in Châtillon-sur-Seine, not far from where it was found. The questions Knussel raised were never fully closed. Research on the wider site, led since the early 1990s by Bruno Schomi, has continued for decades. Geophysical surveys, ground-penetrating radar, drone photogrammetry, and a full re-excavation of the tomb itself in 2019, along with renewed study of 2 life-size limestone statues found nearby in a separate ditched enclosure roughly 200 meters from the burial, a male figure holding a shield and a seated woman wearing a torque almost identical to the one buried with the Lady of Vix. 2 statues standing together for centuries, one armed and one crowned, and archaeologists are still working out what relationship they were built to represent: consorts, ancestors, rival powers, or something closer to a ruler in the office she held. Even now, over 70 years later, archaeologists still argue about exactly what kind of power she held, and whether the poorly documented 1953 excavation, dug quickly, photographed sparsely, and written up in notes that Schoem's own 2018 research flagged as inconsistent, ever recorded the full truth of what was actually found in that chamber before it was carried off to a museum shelf. So when Lavau produced its own gender puzzle in 2014, the parallel was impossible to ignore. Was the Prince of Lavau about to become like the Lady of Vix, a case study in how easily assumptions get buried alongside the evidence, another label written before the bones had a chance to speak? There was only one way to find out. And this time, the conditions were far better than they had been in 1953. At Vix, decades of acidic burgundy soil had degraded much of the skeleton, erasing details that might have settled the debate decades earlier. At Lavau, the oak chamber and the surrounding clay had done something rarer, sealed the body in an environment that preserved bone, tooth, and soft tissue chemistry in far better condition. Everything modern archaeological science can throw at a 2,500-year-old skeleton, INREP could actually attempt. But before the science answered the sex question, it raised new ones. Because the closer specialists looked at the body itself, the stranger the burial became. Start with the teeth. Cementochronology, a technique that reads growth layers in tooth root cementum, roughly the way you'd read rings in a tree, placed the individual's age at death around 30. The teeth themselves were close to flawless. No cavities, no abscesses, no significant tartar buildup, no wear pattern consistent with a hard manual labor diet. For a population where dental disease was common and dental care did not exist in any modern sense, that is not a small detail. It points towards someone who ate well, consistently, for an entire short life, someone protected from childhood, from the wear that ordinary existence leaves behind on ordinary people. Then there was the fracture. The skeleton showed a poorly healed break in the clavicle, along with a slight depression in the skull, injuries consistent with a fall, possibly from a horse, or from the very chariot buried alongside the body. A single violent accident, survived, but never quite fully repaired, carried in the bone for the rest of a short life. Then came the detail that almost slipped past unnoticed. Soil analysts testing the sediment inside the body cavity found something missing: coprostanol, a compound that forms from the breakdown of digestive matter, whose presence or absence tells researchers whether a body's intestines were left in place after death. At Lavau, there was essentially none, which means the body had been eviscerated before burial, opened, and the internal organs removed, in a practice with no clean precedent anywhere in the Celtic archaeological record. Combined with a layer of pollen found beneath the corpse, From plants known for insect repelling and antifungal properties, the evidence points towards something close to embalming, a deliberate, technically informed attempt to preserve this specific body for public viewing, likely over several days, before it finally went into the ground. That is not what a rushed battlefield burial looks like. It is not even what a typical elite Celtic burial looks like. It is closer to the kind of ritual preparation reserved in the Mediterranean world for royalty. Someone in Gaul in 450 BCE appears to have known how to do this, or brought in someone who did, someone whose knowledge traveled with the gold and the bronze. Every one of these details complicated the warrior prince story a little further. No weapons, feminine-coated jewelry, evisceration, a body arranged with theatrical, almost performative care. Was this actually a woman, buried with borrowed masculine authority, the way the Vix theorists once tried, wrongly, to explain away a female skeleton at Mont-le-Soir? Was this, instead, evidence for a completely different kind of Celtic elite? Not a warlord at all, but a ritual figure, someone whose power came from ceremony, trade connections, or bloodline rather than combat. The absence of weapons, some researchers have suggested, could point toward exactly that. Not a warrior, but a figure closer to a priest or a dynastic heir whose status never required a blade to prove it. It's a theory. It is not settled. But given what had already happened once at Vix, it was not a theory anyone in the field was willing to dismiss without testing it properly. So the remains went into a CT scanner at the CHU de Gonesse Hospital, where imaging specialist F. Boursier produced a full three-dimensional model of the skull and skeleton. The same kind of scan used on living patients, now aimed at a body that had been in the ground since before Rome existed. Slice by slice, the scanner built a digital skeleton on the screen, layer stacked on layer, turning brittle bone into data that could be measured, rotated, and checked without ever risking the physical remains themselves. Alongside that, archaeoanthropologist Valérie Delattre carried out a direct pelvic analysis, one of the most reliable skeletal indicators of biological sex available to forensic science. More reliable than a skull, more reliable than height, more reliable than any object buried beside the bones. It is the same basic method used in modern criminal forensics, applied here to a body 2,500 years old. The verdict came back male. For a moment, that should have settled the matter. It didn't. Because a pelvis can tell you what body a person was born into. It cannot tell you who that person was, why they were buried without weapons, or where their ancestors actually came from. And in this case, the next question turned out to be far bigger than the first. Researchers Céline Bon and Sophie Lafosse, working at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from the remains. Confirming sex was only the beginning of what the genetic material could reveal. According to INRAP, the phenotyping, the process of predicting physical traits directly from DNA, pointed toward dark or olive skin, brown eyes, straight hair, and ancestry that traced back toward the Mediterranean rather than the local Iron Age population of Champagne. Sit with that for a second. A Gaulish elite buried in one of the richest known tombs of the entire Celtic Iron Age, whose own genetic ancestry did not match the people living around him. Not distant trading partners across a sea he never crossed. Family history. A lived biological connection to the Mediterranean world, sitting inside a body that had spent 2,500 years labeled without hesitation as purely Celtic. This detail has not yet gone through the full peer review gauntlet that ancient DNA findings usually require, and the genetic study is expected in a later academic volume, still forthcoming as of this telling. So treat it as what INRAP itself has said, a strong, science-based announcement, not yet the final word in a published journal. But even at that stage, it is not a minor claim. It rewrites the most basic assumption behind the word Celtic prince. If the ancestry holds up under further review, the man buried at Lavau was not simply trading with the Mediterranean world from a safe, comfortable distance. His own bloodline came from it. And there was more waiting in that cauldron. Organic residue chemistry, carried out by specialist Nicolas Garnier, tested the interior surface for traces of what it once held. The result, an aromatized red wine, almost certainly imported rather than locally produced, a physical, chemical confirmation that this was not a decorative vessel buried purely for show, but one that had actually been used, filled with drink brought from far outside Gauls' borders. Metallurgical and X-ray analysis at the C2RMF, France's Central Conservation and Research Laboratory for Museum Collections, examined the objects piece by piece, under magnification, under X-ray, under every method restorers have for reading an object without cutting into it, with laboratory trays lined with fragments and screens, glowing with grayscale images of metal that looked, on screen, almost like bone. The cauldron's smelting and engraving work showed a level of technical mastery that stood up against anything the Mediterranean workshops themselves were producing at the same moment in history. And buried among the grave goods was one object with no known parallel anywhere else in the archaeological record. A belt woven with actual threads of silver, worked into Celtic patterns, invisible at first glance under centuries of corrosion, revealed only when X-ray imaging cut straight through the surface and exposed the design hiding underneath, a design no one had known existed until the scan lit it up on screen. Every single test complicated the story further instead of closing it. The pelvis confirmed a man. The DNA suggested foreign ancestry. The residue confirmed foreign wine. The X-rays confirmed foreign-level craftsmanship, fused with unmistakably Celtic design. And the missing weapons, the missing warrior markers, the ritual evisceration, none of that ever went away, no matter how many tests came back. What had walked into this investigation as a simple warrior prince walked out as something far harder to summarize. A young man, likely in his 30s, physically privileged from childhood, possibly connected by blood to the Mediterranean world, buried without a single weapon, prepared through a ritual with no clear local precedent, and surrounded by objects that treated three separate cultures as if they were all equally, unquestionably his own. That is the reversal. Not fake versus real, not warrior versus imposter. Something stranger, a Celtic elite whose identity does not sit neatly inside the box the word Celtic was built over 2 centuries of scholarship to describe. And it does not stop with one tomb. In 2024, a separate research team publishing in Nature Human Behavior carried out genomic and isotope analysis on 31 individuals from early Celtic elite burials in southwestern Germany, spanning roughly from 616 BCE to 200 BCE. 2 of the most famous graves in that dataset belong to the Hallstatt culture, the Prince of Iberdingen-Hochdorf and the Prince of Asperg-Grafenbuhl, buried in separate mounds in separate generations discovered decades apart by different teams who had no reason to think the 2 men were connected at all. Genetic testing found something no one expected. The 2 men were biologically related, as uncle and nephew, connected specifically through the female line. Geneticist Stefan Schiffels, one of the study's authors, put it plainly, only one family arrangement fit the data, with the sister of the Hochdorf prince serving as the mother of the Asperg prince. Co-author Dirk Kraus noted that both men stood close to 6 feet tall, remarkably alike, physically, across a gap of decades, as if the family resemblance had survived where the written record never could. That single genetic link opens a door that historians have argued about for a very long time. If elite status in the early Celtic world could pass down through a sister's bloodline rather than a father's, the whole picture of warrior chief dynasties, passed directly from father to son through conquest and inheritance, starts to look incomplete, maybe even wrong in its basic shape. It doesn't prove every Celtic elite operated this way. It is one documented case from one region involving two specific tombs. But it does mean the tidy, patriarchal warlord model, the same model that once tried to explain away a female skeleton at Vix, the same model that first slapped the word prince onto Lavau without asking harder questions, has now been directly challenged by hard genetic evidence, not once, but at least twice, in two different corners of the Celtic world. Separately, in 2022, a study published in iScience analyzed 49 Iron Age genomes from across present-day France and found no genetic break between the Bronze Age population and the Gaulish population that followed it, undercutting the older idea of a mass Celtic invasion sweeping in from elsewhere and replacing the people already living there. Instead, the study pointed to continuity, layered with real, ongoing gene flow toward Britain and Iberia in both directions. Culture moved, trade moved, people moved, far more than the old borders drawn on any museum map ever suggested they could. None of this hands us a clean, finished answer about who exactly the man buried at Lavau really was. That's the uncomfortable part, and also the honest part. What it does is strip away almost every load-bearing assumption the Celtic prince label was quietly resting on, that he was purely local, that his authority came from combat, that his bloodline stayed neatly inside one tribal boundary. Each of those assumptions has now been tested against real evidence. Each one came back weaker than when it went in. Restoring what came out of that champagne clay took time, money, and a small army of specialists working for years, not months. The full conservation effort, led through the C2 RMF, cost close to €1 million. The cauldron alone, which involved cleaning centuries of corrosion off a single meter-wide vessel without damaging the engraving hiding underneath, required roughly 700 hours of restoration work, hour after hour under magnification, 1 square centimeter at a time. That is not a rounding error in a budget. That is an institution deciding this object was worth an enormous, sustained investment long before the DNA results ever came back to justify the expense. And for almost a decade, the public could not actually see any of it. The grave goods stayed in conservation, in storage, in the careful custody of labs and archives, present in press photographs and academic papers, entirely absent from public display. That changed only recently. On November 18, 2025, the mayor of Troyes, François Barouin, signed a formal partnership with INRAP President Dominique Garcia to bring the Lavau collection home, back to the region where it had spent 2,500 years underground. The exhibition Lavau, un prince celt en bord de Seine, vers 450 avant notre ère, opened at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Troyes on January 24, 2026, and runs through June 21, 2026. Roughly 200 restored objects, about 80 of them pulled directly from the tomb itself, are on public view for the first time since they were lifted out of the ground. One thing is deliberately missing from that display: the skeleton itself. For reasons of conservation, and INRAP has indicated, respect for the individual, the actual human remains, are not part of the public exhibition. The grave goods glow under museum lighting, polished and lit and labeled. The man they were buried with stays in a box somewhere out of sight, still being studied, still refusing to become a finished exhibit. there's a reason that detail matters more than it might first seem. The full scientific record on Lavau is still incomplete. The 2024 monograph, published as a supplement to the journal Gallia and directed by Bastien Dubuis, is only the first of 3 planned academic volumes, with this one covering the wider funerary complex and monument. The tomb itself, and the detailed study of its objects and its DNA, are still to come, still being written, which means the ancestry claim now circulating in exhibition materials and press coverages, technically still ahead of its own final publication. The public got the headline before the field got the full paper. That gap is exactly where disputes tend to grow, and exactly where a museum has to decide how confidently to speak before the science has finished speaking for itself. It's worth widening the lens here because Lavau and Vix are not isolated anomalies. They're symptoms of a much larger shift happening across European archaeology right now. Ancient DNA and isotope work are quietly forcing a rewrite of assumptions that stood, largely unquestioned, for over a century. The idea that the ancient Celtic world was ethnically uniform. The idea that elite power always ran through male warrior lines. The idea that Gauls sat cut off from the Mediterranean, trading occasionally, but never truly connecting, never truly mixing. Objects like the Vix crater and the Lavau cauldron were always physical evidence against that last idea, and nobody seriously argued they arrived by accident. But DNA does something the objects alone never could. It closes the gap between these people, traded with the Mediterranean, and these people, in some documented cases, were the Mediterranean by blood, buried under Gaulish soil wearing Gaulish gold. That is not a small correction to a museum label. It is a challenge to the entire framework historians and curators built around the word Celtic itself, a category that was always more cultural and linguistic than genetic, but has often been treated, in popular imagination and even in some academic writing, as something closer to an ethnic block. Every new genome pulls at that thread a little further, and every institution built around the old framework has to decide how hard to hold on. Who benefits from keeping the old, simpler story in place? Partly, it's just inertia, museum labels, textbook chapters, documentary scripts written decades ago, all repeating a version of Celtic identity that was never quite this complicated to explain to a school group or a visitor passing through on a Sunday afternoon. Partly, it's about national narrative. The Celts occupy a specific place in French and broader European cultural memory, tied up with ideas of ancient, ethnically continuous roots stretching back before Rome, before the modern borders were ever drawn. A prince with Mediterranean ancestry, buried under a French field, sits awkwardly inside that story. Not because the evidence threatens France's history, because it complicates a version of that history that was always simpler than the truth underneath it. And there's a quieter stake here too: funding, prestige, and academic reputation. A grave this rich is a career-defining find. A genome that overturns its own headline claim is the kind of correction institutions are rarely eager to publicize as loudly as the original announcement. None of this means the wildest theories win by default. Nobody is claiming Lavau was secretly a Greek colony, or that Vix was ruled by a hidden Mediterranean dynasty operating in disguise. That would be overselling evidence that is still partial, and in the case of the DNA phenotyping, still headed toward formal peer review. But it does mean the simple version, isolated Gaulish tribes, occasional trade with far-off Greeks, a straightforward warrior prince ruling by the sword alone, no longer survives contact with the evidence. It hasn't been replaced with a wilder story. It's been replaced with a more honest, more tangled one. And honest is rarely as tidy as the museum plaque suggests it should be. Back in Troyes, under gallery lighting, that gold torque sits behind reinforced glass, restored down to its smallest engraved detail, alongside a cauldron that took 700 hours to bring back from corrosion. Visitors walk past it reading a label that says, prints. Most of them will never learn that the word barely survived the last 10 years of testing, that it was checked, questioned, and nearly overturned before it was allowed to stay on the wall. The bronze face of Akaloo still stares out from the rim, exactly the way it did the moment it broke the surface of that trench in October 2014. Except now, everyone standing in that room is looking at an object that has quietly outgrown its own name. 200 kilometers away, inside a former abbey in Burgundy, another glass case holds a Greek crater, over 200 kilograms of hammered bronze, taken from a mound that once held a woman modern archaeology spent decades trying, wrongly, to turn into a man. 2 graves, 2 genders, 2 separate centuries of excavation, and underneath both of them the same unfinished argument. How much of what we call ancient Celtic history was actually written not by the people who lived it, but by the assumptions of the people who dug it up centuries later, brushed it clean, and decided what word to put on the label before all the evidence was even in? The final DNA papers on Lavau haven't been published yet. The skeleton stays in storage, unseen, still waiting on tests that haven't finished running, somewhere in an INRAP archive. In a folder marked for a future volume of Gallia, sits the detailed genetic profile of a man buried with more Mediterranean gold than most Mediterranean royalty ever owned in their own lifetimes. A man history is still, quietly, deciding what to call. Until that folder finally opens, the cauldron keeps its place behind the glass, lit, restored, and finally public after 2,500 years underground. And the label beside it keeps saying Prince, as if the question were ever actually closed.